Next lecture is based on spatial models, and a model is a description of reality, and specifically for GIS, we're looking at computer-based models of spatial phenomenon. And these models describe the basic properties or processes for a set of spatial features, and these models help us understand their form and behavior. So there are three types of models that we'll be covering in this lecture. The first one are cartographic models, the second one is simple spatial models, and the third one is spatiotemporal models. So for the first one, cartographic models solve problems via spatial layer combinations. So when we are combining spatial layers, we are using GIS operation tools. These operation tools are overlay, and especially in ArcGIS Online, the overlay layers tool combines two layers into a single layer using one of the two methods, which are intersect and union. The next operation tool are buffers, and in ArcGIS Online, this is the Create Buffers tool, and this creates an area that extends a specified distance around each input point, line, or polygon feature. And we have reclassification. So if you have land cover changes, such as, or land use cover, you have it in separate classifications such as forest, wetlands, croplands, and you just want to narrow it down to wetlands, you would have to use reclassification. So for cartographic models, you will be using GIS operation tools, and most common cartographic models are suitability analysis, and suitability analysis are based on a set of criteria. For our lab course this week, you will be doing your lab assignment on performing a site suitability analysis for a new wind farm in the state of Colorado, and you will be following a set of criteria. And the set of criteria, for example, choose a location in counties where the population as of 2010 is at least 20,000, and also another criteria is within 10 miles of existing power lines, so you are using the buffers tool for that criteria. And GIS queries and processing combine the map data layers either to mask unsuitable or to highlight suitable locations. So for your lab assignment, you will be telling me your suitable sites and the pros and cons for that suitable site that were chosen from running your analysis. Another example, where are the most suitable locations for a new hospital in a fast-growing urban area? So this method is commonly applied to establish suitability of locations for public or private facilities and institutions, as well as it plays a major role and significant role in making decisions and planning decisions. So this figure is from our textbook, and this is an example of a suitability map produced by combining soils, elevation, wetland, and watercourse data. These analyses are often automated via a cartographic model to produce suitability or other nominal or ordinal rankings over large areas. So the common outputs for cartographic models are nominal or ordinal ranking. Cartographic models are often represented by flowcharts. This is an example of a flowchart, and a flowchart is a graphic representation of the spatial data and its operations and their sequence of use in a cartographic model. So we can see here that we have three data layers we start off with, and these data layers are represented by rectangles. And our operations are represented by ellipses. And we could see that it's showing us the order of operations by arrows. So the lakes, they buffered the lakes and it created a new layer called lakes buffer. And then they were doing another operation tool. They want to combine the lakes buffer with the roads buffer, and when they either use intersect or union, our output layer is called the combined buffers. So after doing these analysis with these operations, we finally have our final layer, which is called the suitability ranking layer. And this layer summarizes the ranking of lands based on the provided criteria. And it's very important to design the best cartographic model. To do that, you want to use the appropriate spatial tools and the best sequence. And we can see that here we used 3 different spatial tools: buffer, reclass, and overlay. So it's very important to know what type of tools you need to find a suitable location. So with a small set of tools and data layers, we can create a huge number of cartographic models. These are the different types of applications used for cartographic models. We can see urban and regional planning. You can also use these models to monitor forest succession, monitor infectious disease outbreaks, and to assess snowpack to predict water availability. So what steps should be taken in a cartographic model for a site suitability analysis? Well, you would need to first identify the goal of the analysis. Next, you want to identify the criteria for suitability analysis. So you will be going through these steps in your lab assignment. You'll be identifying the necessary data layers and GIS operations. And our GIS operations are either, for example, buffer, overlay, or reclassification. You're going to create a flow chart. You're going to go through analysis, and you're going to try this analysis more than once. And lastly, model verification. Our next type of model is the simple spatial models, and the simple spatial models focus on applying mathematical relationships, and this is based on one or a few equations, and you often apply sets of equations to predict a specific continuous variable across space. So an example of a continuous variable would be temperature, because it can take on any value within a range. And the outputs for simple spatial models are interval or ratio. So for examples would be population density, accident frequency, or soil erosion rates. We are going to look at a popular simple spatial model that looks at soil erosion rates in the next slide. But this is an example of a simple spatial model where a function is applied to spatial inputs to estimate an important spatial output. So here we have 5 layers, and we are doing a simple function here, a mathematical equation, and when you do that mathematical equation on those layers, you will have your final output. So this is one of the most widely used simple spatial model. It's called RUSLE, which stands for Revised Universal Soil Loss Equation. So we could see this is the equation used for this simple spatial model. We are using simple multiplication. And we could see E here is giving us our average annual erosion. And so you'll find your E when you multiply these 6 factors. And R stands for rainfall factor, K stands for soil erodibility, C stands for crop effects, and P accounts for management practices, and L and S represents our slope, length, and steepness. So when you multiply these factors, you will get your average annual erosion rate. And this simple spatial model, RUSLE, is commonly used to predict soil erosion on farm fields. Here is an example of RUSLE being used, and we can see here that this layer, they had to use different functions, like here table join, and then you export that. After you use your table join, we have our K layer, and K layer is part of our equation here, and we could see our C layer and our LS layer and our PR layer. So when you combine these layers into that equation, you will get your final erosion estimates, your final map. Our last type of simple data models are the spatiotemporal models. And the spatiotemporal data models are ways of organizing representations of space and time in a GIS. So again, spatiotemporal relates to space and time. And this uses spatially explicit inputs to calculate or predict spatially explicit outputs. So for example, if we are using a demographic model, our explicit inputs would be our current population in a census, also housing availability and cost, and also the age and marital status of the population. So when we use these inputs, this will help us to predict our output, and for the demographic model, we want to predict the future population for the census tract. So again, that's one way to apply this spatiotemporal data models. And also you can use it to predict fire behavior, wildfire behavior. And this is an active area of research due to requiring analysis and prediction of spatially and time-varying phenomenon. So here is figure 13-18, and the spatiotemporal models combine spatial and aspatial data with time-variant functions to produce spatial output. So here is an example of our aspatial data, tabular data, and then we have our spatial data and our geographic region. And when we combine all of these, we get our spatial output. So our spatiotemporal models can either use continuous or discontinuous data. Continuous data, these are examples, which are air temperature, precipitation, soil moisture, and atmospheric pollutants. So models of continuous phenomenon predict values that vary smoothly across time or space. And for a spatiotemporal discontinuous phenomenon, these are examples: land use and vegetation types. So land use is a discrete variable because it is made up of distinct separate categories such as forest, agriculture, urban areas. And vegetation types can be discrete as well because you can separate vegetation types from grassland and a forest type. And a spatial model may predict the encroachment of forest on grassland sites. So that's one way we could apply the spatial model to these phenomena. Here's another example of spatiotemporal phenomenon. Here we could see there's an expansion of a city, The area covered by the city grows over time, but the location of the city does not change. And for diagram B, we could see that the car is moving and it's changing its position through its time, but the object car does not change size or shape. And in this example, we could see over time the position of a cloud will change, but also the size and shape of the cloud can undergo changes over time. Other examples of spatial temporal models are the process-based hydrologic models, and these are often used to predict the temporal fluctuations in soil moisture, lake or stream water levels, and stream discharge. And these models are important because we need to use them to improve water management resources and to avoid loss of property or life due to flooding. So we can see here in this figure, this is a raster-based hydrologic model, and we could see that it's representing water flow through each grid cell. So these are satellite imagery, or because we know it's a raster-based model, we are using satellite imagery because of the pixel sizes. And we could see this is the stream network and our watershed boundary. Our next application is Landis, which is a forest change model. And Landis also uses raster-based data. We are using satellite imagery because satellite imagery uses pixel sizes and cells. And Landis is applied to forest biomes around the world. This is a stochastic model, and it's important to analyze current and future forest conditions. And the reason for that is because forest vegetation changes through time, and the changes may be caused by the natural aging and death of a group of trees, like we see here in this part of the satellite imagery. This represents sudden oak deaths. Also, this is the forest composition on this side of the satellite imagery, and we can see that the changes can occur due to periodic disturbances such as wildfires, like we see here. And Landis incorporates natural and human disturbances, seed dispersal, plant establishment, and succession through time to predict changes in forest composition through spatial and temporal scales. So that's it for this week's lecture. Thank you for watching.